Okay, we continue, I should say, with the story of Elisha, and we go to 2 Kings 5, and I want to read the first 14 verses. It's a bit long, but it's one story, and it's a story we all know actually, but again, as often when we study it a bit deeper, we find many things that we can learn from. 2 Kings 5 verse 1. Now Naaman, captain of the hosts of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master, and honorable, because by him the Lord had given deliverance unto Syria. He was also a mighty man in valor, but he was a leper. And the Syrians had gone out by companies, and had brought away captive out of the land of Israel a little maid. And she waited on Naaman's wife. And she said unto her mistress, Would God my Lord were with the prophet that is in Samaria, for he would recover him of his leprosy. And one went in and told his Lord, saying, Thus and thus said the maid that is of the land of Israel. And the king of Syria said, Go, and I will send a letter unto the king of Israel. And he departed, and he took with him 10 talents of silver, and 6,000 pieces of gold, and 10 changes of raiment. And he brought the letter to the king of Israel, saying, Now when this letter is come unto thee, behold, I have therewith sent Naaman my servant to thee, that thou mayest recover him of his leprosy. And it came to pass, when the king of Israel had read the letter, that he rent his clothes, and said, Am I God, to kill and make alive, that this man doth send unto me to recover a man of his leprosy? Wherefore consider, I pray you, and see how he seeketh a quarrel against me. And so it was so. When Elisha, the man of God, had heard that the king of Israel had rent his clothes, that he sent to the king, saying, Wherefore hast thou rent thy clothes? Let him come now to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. So Naaman came with his horses and with his chariot, and stood at the door of the house of Elisha. And Elisha sent a messenger unto him, saying, Go and wash in Jordan 7 times, and thy flesh shall come again to thee, and thou shalt be clean. But Naaman was wroth, and went away, and said, Behold, I thought he will surely come out to me, and stand, and call on the name of the Lord his God, and strike his hand over the place, and recover the leper. Are not Abana and Pharpar rivers of Damascus better than all the waters of Israel? May I not wash in them, and be clean? So he turned and went away in a rage. And his servants came near, and spake unto him, and said, My father, if the prophet had bid thee to do some great thing, wouldest thou not have done it? How much rather then, when he said to thee, Wash and be clean? Then he went down, and dipped himself 7 times in Jordan, according to the saying of the man of God. And his flesh came again unto the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. Okay, on the first surface, when you read it first time, you think, well, good, great miracle. Elisha, the man of God, he tells him, wash yourself, and he did so, and he was healed. That's it. But everything that happens in between actually makes the story so different than what it looks like at the beginning. First of all, you might ask yourself, why is a leper the host, the captain of the army? Normally lepers were outside the city, they were separate. And so this is a strange thing. But even from the words of Jesus we learn something. In Luke 4 verse 27, Jesus says, And many lepers were in Israel in the time of Eliseus, that's Elisha, the prophet, and none of them was cleansed, saving Naaman the Syrian. So many lepers were in Israel, he says, Now, Naaman was not in Israel, he was in Syria, or in the Dutch translation it says Aram. Aram is same as Syria. So this means the whole region was filled with leprosy. The disease was everywhere, and so it was impossible to keep people separate. It were not just a few, it was everywhere. And so they were just wherever they were, and even as a captain of the host of Syria. So that says something, but Jesus then adds something. He says none of them was cleansed. No one was ever healed from this. Only Naaman, this is the only one. So until that moment, no one was healed, and that explains the response of the king of Israel, of course. Who am I? Am I God to do such a thing? It's impossible. So, widespread disease. Sounds familiar in our days, by the way. Anyway, we learn from verse 1 a lot about Naaman. First of all, he was high in rank. He was the captain of the host. He was the general, the highest you have. Under the king, you have the captain of the host. He controls the whole army. That was him. He is high in rank. Secondly, he was well respected. It says he was a great man with his master. His master was the king. His king respected him. He was well respected. And he was brave. He was a mighty man in valor, it says. It means he was brave. He was a real warrior. And the last thing we learn is the most peculiar. That is, that he was successful in war. But then it explains why. Not because he was brave, not because he was such a great man, but because the Lord had given him deliverance unto Syria. The Lord's hand was on him, totally godless man, by the way. He knew nothing about the God of Israel, but yet God knew him, and God was directing his life. And that is, in this story, in the beginning, the first half of what we read, it's all about providence. The Lord working behind the scenes without people knowing to work out his plan, to save a soul. And that is what is happening here. Naaman was great because of God, and he didn't know it. He didn't know it. It also shows us here, as by the way in many Old Testament scriptures, that God was not only working in Israel, and God was not only the God of the Israelites. He is the God of all people. He was working everywhere where it fit his plan. Unfortunately, many Israelis, many Jews, even today, still think that their God is their God exclusively. And of course we know from the New Testament it's not so, but actually also the Old Testament shows us this time after time. So Naaman, when we go through the list of all the things he had, great man, respected, brave, successful in war, you would think he had everything he could wish for. Everything. But in the last part of verse 1, there's a comma, and then it says, but he was a leper. And that destroys everything. No one would want to be in his place. Not the lowest soldier or slave would want to be like him. Because he was a leper. Destroyed everything. That was his big cross, you can say. And when a man suffers from health issues, it puts its mark on everything. It throws a shadow upon life. This is a very difficult thing. And I'm sure Naaman was happy and proud when he would win a battle, but he would look on his skin and he would feel sad again. Nothing could take that away. Without physical health, life loses its shine. And this, people who are sick know this very well, of course. And we see, of course, now something else happening in the world with a virus that is threatening the health of people. And you see that there is a response. when your health is compromised or is threatened even, you want to prevent that. You want to be healthy. You want to do anything to get rid of this curse, I would say. And we see it. Even now, today, people say, when is this vaccine coming? Because I want it. I want to go back to normal life. Others, this is something that's going on for years. They go to transhumanism. They want to see how they can improve their body so that they don't grow old, or they can live longer. And even others, rich people, they know that they will die, but they have their bodies frozen so that they can, in some future, they can live again. People do all kinds of things to defy the aging and the decay of their body and to gain immortality. We see here that because of God's providence, Naaman had become a great man. But it was also God's work that he had leprosy. And this was part of his path towards salvation. And it's something that afterwards he would say, it was good that I had leprosy, because this is how I got saved. But at that moment, of course, it was the worst thing he could think of. And so in Psalm 119, verse 71, it says, "It's good for me that I have been afflicted, that I might learn thy statutes." When you can say that, you're actually blessed. Even although you might have suffered from so many bad things. So bad things that happen to us, it's not always that God is punishing us, that is judgment. It's often so that he's directing us, he's moving us in a direction that we would otherwise not go by our own. God had purposed Naaman to receive his mercy. And God had done so for his glory, for God's glory. And to show that his grace is also for the Gentiles. It's not only for the Jews, it's not only for the Israelites, it's available for everyone. And now comes the second thing. This is the verse 2. This little girl, little maid it said, but in Hebrew it's clear that this applies to someone of young age. Someone like you, I think. Probably the same age thereabout. And it says they had gone out in companies, the Syrians. The Syrians were strong, they were mightier than Israel, and they were often going in with companies, with small army units, into Israel, and they were just raiding. They were plundering and stealing and taking people for slaves, like this girl. And that's what they do. And the Israelites, they could not do anything. King Ahab, he was able to keep them out, but Ahab had now died, and his son was reigning, and his son was young and inexperienced. He was not a warrior, as we have already learned from the war he waged against Ammon, the Ammonites. He was not able to do anything. He was very afraid, actually. So this girl was just taken during one of these raids of the Syrians, and she ended up in Naaman's house as a slave girl or a servant of his wife. In English it says she waited on Naaman's wife, but she was a servant of Naaman's wife. And it's very interesting, if you look at this, it's very similar to the story of Joseph. Joseph ended up against his will in another country, away from his family, as a servant in the house of Potiphar. And this girl was the same. She was in another country, away from her family, lost everything. Just try to imagine that they just take you to another country and you have to serve there. You cannot go back, you cannot do anything. But she also responds in a similar way as Joseph. Joseph didn't get bitter and angry with the ones that took him. He trusted his God. And this girl does the same. She doesn't get angry, she doesn't get bitter, she doesn't sit in a corner crying the whole day how pitiful she is. No, she trusts her Lord. And she is made into a blessing. And we don't read about her afterwards, but for sure she has been rewarded for what she done. Maybe they sent her back because she was so good, who knows. But in any case, God used her because of her strong faith. And this is something to think about. Each of these characters in this story, you have to imagine you being one of these characters. What would you do if you were Naaman? What would you do if you were this girl? What would you do if you were the king? And if you are honest with yourself, you see that you will make many mistakes and you will often not act like this girl did. Even though she was so young and most of us are more matured, we would not have this strong faith and act this way. We can learn a lot here. Being in such a position where everything is against you, the thing is not to get angry, not to get frustrated, but to look upon the Lord. Lord, what do you want to do with this situation? And what do you want me to do? In Genesis 42, verse 36, we find Jacob, and we read about Jacob a while ago. And you see that Jacob, he makes many mistakes. He's a human. But he is also all the time feeling sorry for himself instead of seeking the Lord. In spite of the promises that God had given to Abram and to Isaac and to him personally. And there in verse 36, Jacob says to his sons, "Me have you bereaved of my children. Joseph is not, and Simeon is not, and you will take Benjamin away. All these things are against me." He feels sorry for himself. It's bad for him. He cannot see at that point, which it's logic, but he cannot see that actually God is working out his plan. And all this will lead to something glorious. And this is what we often have. When we're in the midst of problems, we cannot see the end of it. And so we think everything works against me. We feel sorry for ourselves. God, please help me. Instead of saying, God, what do you want me to do? And trusting that He is in control. So this girl makes now the remark to her mistress, and in the original language it is actually very nice. In the Dutch that you read, it's a bit less clear, but she says, "Would God, my Lord, were with the prophet." So if God only wanted my master to meet the prophet, it's almost, or maybe it is, like a prayer. If God only wanted this to happen, if this is God's plan, it would be wonderful. This is how she says it. She doesn't say, if he would know the prophet in Israel, he would be healed. No, if God would want that, if this was God's plan, that would be the best thing. And that is exactly what's going to happen, of course. Naaman, again, he had so much. High in rank, respected, brave. Next to the king, he was the highest actually in position. But this girl had something far greater. She had the knowledge of God, and she had her faith in God, and that is the greatest thing you can possess. In the same Psalm 119 in verse 72, it says, "The law of thy mouth is better unto me than thousands of gold and silver." Naaman had gold and silver for sure, but it couldn't help him. But what this girl had could help him. So it's nice the way, nice is an understatement, but the way this girl expresses herself shows also that it's not her wish, I want this to go that way, but she seeks God's will. If it only was God's will, how good would that be? She shows a few things. First of all, she shows compassion towards her master. She felt sorry for him. And it was a genuine feeling. Because she spoke out. She could also have just thought it and not say anything. Because who knows what the consequences are if you say such a thing. She spoke out. The Syrians did not respect the God of Israel. They had their own God, Rimmon. And that was God. And there was no other God. So it was risky even to speak about the God of Israel. But she does. She has compassion. And many, if you're honest with yourself and you think yourself in this position, many of us would not have felt sorry for this guy, would actually secretly have felt he gets what he deserves. He took me away and he has a bad disease. Good for him. This is how our nature usually is. So she was not acting according to human nature. She was acting in the spirit, you can say. She had also loyalty. She was honoring her master and she desired his well-being. And in that she was honoring God. And Paul makes this clear that this should be our position, even in the world, in a godless world. This girl was in a godless world, and so are we. In 1 Timothy 6, verse 1, Paul writes, "Let as many servants as are under the yoke count their own masters worthy of all honor, that the name of God and his doctrine be not blasphemed." And he speaks here about masters that are not Christians, that are not brethren in Christ. He speaks about that also later in this chapter, but here he speaks about godless masters. And if you're under their yoke, then even then you treat them honorably and with loyalty. Why? So that God's name and God's doctrine is not blasphemed. And that is not an easy thing to do. Especially if you're oppressed or exploited. That's very hard actually to do. And it's this girl is not living by the letter of the law. This is very similar to what we read last week about this farmer who came to bring bread. He was also not doing the letter of the law. But he was going beyond it, to the spirit of the law. The letter of the law says, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. So, good for you. You took me away, you have a bad disease. No, the spirit of the law, as Jesus explains in Matthew 5, says, love your enemies and pray for those that persecute you. Do good to them that hate you. It's not an easy thing, but that's actually what is being asked from us. Another thing we learn from this is that young people, and we spoke about young people also last week, so this is especially for the two of you and almost also a bit for you. But the young, they can be greatly used for good. Never think, I'm too young for this, God cannot use me, or it's for later. Later I will be serious about my faith when I'm older or when I'm an adult or whatever. No, it's now. This is the time. God can use young people greatly for good. And there are quite a few examples actually in Scripture about that. Joseph was also very young when he entered the house of Potiphar. David was 17 when he defeated Goliath. So we see often young people that are used for great things by God. It's all depending on the heart. We also see that the most humble may have the greatest power. This girl was the lowest in the household. Also, first of all, she was a girl, and in these societies, girls and women were always lower. And she was very young, and she was also a servant. So you cannot get lower in the household. But she had the greatest power there. Why? Because she acted in faith. And what we also see is that often the great, they depend on the small. Naaman thought he was in control of everything, and he was in control of a lot, but he could not help himself health-wise. This little girl could. Well, God, of course, could through this girl. And lastly, we see that we should do good to others even if they are our enemies. It is actually a form of evangelizing. It is not that these people deserve that we do good to them. They don't deserve it. But by doing so, we show how great God is. That is what's happening, and God can do something. And it's a way, it's a way of evangelizing. Franciscus, not the Pope, but the monk he is named after, said, preach the gospel always. If necessary, use words. It is the attitude with which you show the God that lives inside you. So this was all the providence. This was all happening behind the scenes. God was doing something there in this household of Naaman. And this remark that this little girl made, it reached the king of Syria. And then you have to notice something again. How is the king of Syria called? The king of Syria. He has no name. In the whole story, his name is never mentioned. And we know this, we've seen this before. This is on purpose. Why his role is actually insignificant. It's a degradation. He's a godless man, and he shows it, by the way, clearly that he's a totally godless man and arrogant. He goes without name. But this king, he valued his general. We read that already in verse 1. He wanted to take action. He wanted also for Naaman to be healthy. He liked him. He was a good general, so why not? So he writes this letter, and he sends Naaman with the letter to the king of Israel. And the king of Israel, how is he called? The king of Israel. He goes without name. We know who it is. It's Jehoram. We've seen him a few chapters back when we were introduced to him, the son of Ahab. And Jehoram is mentioned, and after that he is simply called the king of Israel. His name means the Lord raises up, but he's not worthy of his name. Nothing in him raises up the Lord, and so he goes without name. Also here in this story, both kings go without name. And both kings, they prove something. And these are the highest. If we look in the ranks of men, the girl is the lowest. And the kings are the highest. Naaman is somewhere in between. The kings are the highest. And both, they prove that they have no understanding whatsoever of the God of Israel. They don't understand a thing. The king of Syria shows, first of all, arrogance. He is the most powerful one. He is more powerful than the king of Israel, and he knows it. He knows he can do anything, say anything, ask anything, and if the king of Israel would not comply, then he would just attack him. He had the power to do so. So he simply demands in the letter, get Naaman cured. It's your problem now. Here he is. You deal with it. But there's also ignorance. As if the king of Israel has the power to do so. And of course the King Jehoram, he says himself, am I God? What can I do? So it's ignorant to think that you can just order something from this man. He cannot do anything, of course. But he probably thought that the king of Israel could command Elisha, the prophet, to heal Naaman. After all, Elisha was an Israeli citizen. He thought in his mind that Elisha was serving the king of Israel. He forgot one thing: Elisha was serving God, not the king of Israel. Remember what Elisha said when this king of Israel, Jehoram, came to his door. He said, what have I to do with you? He has no respect for this king whatsoever. Why? Because this king has no respect for his God. It's very similar to what we see today in governments and world leaders. They are ignorant and they are arrogant. They have no clue what they talk about when they order how churches should operate, how religion should be executed. They think they can just say whatever they want. You can only gather with so many people. You're not allowed to sing, and you're not allowed to do this or that, as if it depends on them. Or like in the United States, where, but it's similar in other countries, where most churches are under the 501c3 regulation, which means they are like a tax benefit. But because of that, they have a whole list of things that they are allowed to say and that they are not allowed to say. So basically the government is in control of what is being preached. Or the government of China, who's rewriting the Bible to make it government-friendly instead of God-friendly. And they dictate how believers should worship, if they are allowed to worship at all. Or in Russia, where last year Putin made a law that it's only allowed to evangelize inside the church, which means the Russian Orthodox Church. So these leaders think that they can say these things, that they are in control. They forget about God. Apparently they don't believe in God. So, and also this king of Syria thinks that you can buy things with money. Money can do many things. He sends not only Naaman with a letter, but he sends also gold and silver and clothing as a payment. It's a large sum of money. He had no idea about God. And again, there are world leaders like that. They think money can do everything. Let's buy Iceland. Why not? Let's buy TikTok. It's now today in the news. Money can do everything. Well, not so. Actually, the money that this king of Syria sends, we will read it the next time, this money will bring someone down. Naaman will be saved, but someone else will be brought down because of this money. It will do more harm than good. That's the king of Syria. Then you have the king of Israel. He's not better, we know it already, but now we find out he hasn't learned anything since the other time that he had a war against Ammon. His first response says it all in verse 7. When he read the letter, he rent his clothes. Am I God? He is desperate. What can I do? And he tears his clothes. First thing he thinks of is himself. What can I do? Am I God? Surely the king of Syria is just making this up so that he has an excuse to attack me. He's asking something impossible. He knows that I cannot do it, and then he will attack. He's thinking about himself. He's not thinking about God. He's not thinking about Elisha either. Although he knew him by now. What is being asked from him is indeed impossible for him. As we read from Jesus' words from Luke, no one was cured from leprosy ever until that moment. No one. So it's impossible. It didn't exist. It never happened. So he's cornered. He's with his back to the wall. He's too weak to make war against Syria. He knows that. He knows he will lose that war. Actually, that will happen later and will also go different than he thinks. But anyway, this is his mind. It's interesting, this type of characters, and there are several in the Bible, Old and New Testament, that think like this. His first thing is suspicion. The king of Syria must do this on purpose so that he has an excuse to attack me. Suspicion, and then he's going to judge based on that suspicion. People that do this, in general, this is beginner's psychology, you can say. People who are like that, they are often selfish and they are dishonest and false. And from their perspective, all the others are like that. All the others are like they are themselves. So he doesn't trust the king of Syria because he himself cannot be trusted. That is basically what's happening. So, but God, for his glory, he does not allow the king of Israel to go down, which could easily have happened. But somehow, we don't know how, somehow the news that the king tore his clothes reaches Elisha. It's not so that the king says, the prophet, yes, of course, I delivered this letter, or have my servants call Elisha. No, he does not call Elisha. Elisha calls him. The news reaches him, and it's Elisha who approaches the king. Which is interesting. Basically, Elisha is saying, between the lines, it doesn't say, but he's saying, have you still not learned anything? You're panicking and thinking of yourself, and God has already proven himself to you. So what does he say, Elisha? This is again interesting. He shall send him to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. Not he shall know that there is a king in Israel. He already knows there's a king, and the king is useless. But he will find that there is a prophet. Why is the king useless? Because he's godless. As is, by the way, also the king of Syria. Because he could also do nothing. He has to send his general to the enemy, basically. Because he cannot do anything. It's also interesting to note that the king of Israel, Jehoram, he rent his clothes. And we've seen this also before. This is what Elisha did when he was first called by Elijah. He rent his clothes. It's a sign of what I'm doing now. The purpose for which I'm wearing these clothes, this is over. This was the old life of Elisha as a farmer. Or Caiaphas, the high priest, does the same when Jesus is before him. He's basically showing this office of high priest, it's over. And here the king does the same. Without, of course, realizing, but he is showing, I'm not worthy to be a king. I'm not even a king, actually. So, interesting. And he plays no further role in this whole story. We don't hear about him again anymore. These great men, these kings, they are actually very small men in reality. Now, the healing happens, the miracle, and what we see here is greater than natural power. It's greater than the power of these kings. It's greater than the power of money. Why is it greater than natural power? Because it is supernatural. Supernatural and supernatural things that God does, they offend human pride. That is what is happening here. The kings and rulers, and even Naaman, the general, they are filled with pride. Their pride makes them the man that they are. That makes them arrogant, that makes them ignorant. And when God comes in, pride is offended. Pride is one of the biggest problems that we struggle with. Also, the miracle contradicts the prejudice. Naaman says, we have great rivers in Damascus. They are much better than all the water in Israel. Why should I go in Jordan? So, maybe logic, but God doesn't work with logic. This is what he asks. Bathe yourself in the Jordan. And we see also what we've seen in the other miracles. It's simple. God works with simple means. He doesn't ask something complicated. Just go, dip yourself 7 times in the Jordan. It's a simple thing. And but because it's so simple, Naaman doesn't want to do it. It requires faith. And that's also what we've seen from the previous miracles. It requires work of faith. You have to do something that is simple, that doesn't make sense, but do it in faith, obey. And then God will do his part. And the last thing we see about the miracle is that it is complete. He is totally cured. He's clean. God does not do half work. There are often all kinds of miracle workers out in the streets and about doing their miracles, and you see very often they are half miracles, or they only last for a day. And that's not from God. It's not from God. 7 times he has to dip himself in the Jordan. 7 is the number of completeness. God would not use any other number than 7. This is what we expect. So a little back up and then we finish. this company appears on Elisha's doorstep. They go to his house, it says. And this is Naaman, but he's not alone. He's with multiple servants. He has all this gold and silver with him, this clothes, so these are probably several horses, maybe a carriage with carrying all this stuff. And he is the general of the Syrian army, the highest ranked. So you may be sure that there is a whole company of soldiers with him to protect him. Because they would not want him to get killed, of course. So it's a large group that comes there in front of Elisha's house. So you just have to imagine that on the street in front of your house, there comes a big army van and 20 other trucks and soldiers and a whole theater there. You would be quite impressed, I think. Yeah, you would be quite impressed. But Elisha is not impressed. He's not impressed. Just as before, when there came 3 kings to his house, he said, "What do I have to do with you?" He was not impressed.
He didn't come to the door.
He didn't even come to the door. He sends a servant. You go and tell him to go bathe himself in the river. He doesn't even bother to come out. But why? Why does Elisha do that? He has a purpose. He wants to show Naaman something. Naaman is fighting, or is not fighting yet, but he will fight with his pride. His pride is in the way. And he is showing here that Naaman is actually just another man. He's nothing special. And he is opposing his pride. This has to break. And you see from the response of Naaman how proudful he is. He gets angry. And why would I do this? I had expected him to come out and to call upon his God to do a theater. And this is what many people expect, theater. And so, when many people expect theater, there are many ministers and ministries that give theater. They have stages with smoke and light and much sound and miracles and big things. They provide theater because that's what the people want. Then they experience God. But that is not the God of the Bible. He doesn't work that way. Think of when he asked the woman, the widow, to collect some, or not some, as many as he could, empty vessels. And he said to her, "Close the door upon you and upon your boys." He didn't want to make a theater out of it. This is a sacred, intimate work of God, between God and man. And so God was offering Naaman here also this intimate miracle to happen for him. And but Naaman couldn't see how special this was, what was being asked from him. It was a very simple question. Just go to the Jordan, dip yourself in 7 times. And but just like the digging of the trenches and like the collecting of empty vessels or the meal in the pot, simple things, but it requires faith. Just obey. Don't try to figure out why and whether it's logic and all these things. We tend to do the opposite. We want to do complicated things. We want to do things with which we can prove something, as if we need to prove something to God. We rather do works than show obedience. And so you see many religions, they ask for works, to do works. To say certain prayers at certain hours and all these things. It's not what God asks. So in spite of the fact that it was God's providence that had made Naaman great, and it was God's providence through this girl that he was led to Elisha, in spite of the fact that he could not help himself in any way, in spite of all that, his pride was in the way. This is typical of human nature. When everything falls down and God is ready to touch us, then it's our pride that stands as a wall in between, and it has to come down. And ironically, Naaman is on his way back. He says, "I'm not going to do this." He's on his way. If nothing would have happened, he would have gone back to Syria, and he would have stayed a leper the rest of his life. But ironically, it's one of his servants, or several of his servants, we don't know exactly, but that say, why wouldn't you do it? It's so simple what's being asked from you. If he would have asked something complicated, you would have done it. And now you have this simple thing and you don't do it. It is just the same as with Jehoram back then when he went to war. It was also one of his servants that reminded him of the prophet. There is Elisha, the man who was washing Elias' hands. And so, through the words of the servant, Naaman says, okay, let me give it a shot. And he goes, and then it's actually very shortly described. He went down, did himself 7 times in Jordan, and he was clean. But it adds something according to the saying of the man of God. 3 times before in this section, Elisha is called by name. In verse 8, 9 and 10, he's called Elisha, now he's called the man of God. This playing with names and titles is very interesting throughout all of 2 Kings. It's not because Elisha said so, it's because God said so. He is the man of God, he is the mouth of God, so to speak. That's why God is finishing the work that he began with Naaman. The work that he began long before, when he made him a great man, when he gave him the disease, and when he allowed him to take this little girl into his house. Although the work is not finished yet, by the way, but that's for another time. But this is what happens. So, again, try to picture yourself in each one of these different characters and ask yourself, what would I do? And what would I do and what should I have done? Everything that happens here is in the plan of God. It's the providence of God and it's to the glory of God. And that is how our lives should be. All to the glory of God and in the will of God. He is doing also things behind the scenes that we don't know, that we don't see, or some things we do see, they don't make sense to us. We think maybe nothing of it actually, but they serve a purpose. And so we should do like this little girl actually. Would only God, if this would be God's plan, if this would be God's will, and seek his will, ask for it, and he will show. Amen.